Hello, and welcome to episode 21 of the Rain Check podcast, the mother and son discussion of the kings and queens of England. Oh, and for this episode only, a woman who was neither of those two things. I'm Donna.
And I'm Austin. And welcome
And
to a very special episode.
that's right. It's a very special episode because I am writing a book about Adela of Blois, Countess Adela, daughter of William the Conqueror, who may or may not have looked anything like the image that Austin just put up. And so Austin allowed me to do an episode about her. And I think you're going to enjoy it because Baudry of Bourgel, who was a poet of the 11th century, wrote a poem to Adela, one of many poets who honored Adela in poetry. And he called her a countess worthy of being called a queen. So even if she wasn't officially a queen, she was deemed worthy of being a queen. And she was a queen mother because her son became king, and she was a princess, and she was the sister of multiple kings. So there you go.
And sometimes those are the most interesting people because they have so many connections with other famous people that you get to kind of learn about all of them in one.
That's right. So per the historian who wrote the Bible about Adela, Kimberly Lopre, Adela was one of the most influential power brokers of the late 11th and early 12th centuries, and she spent 40 years being one of the most powerful women in France. She was born in 1067 or early 1068, and why that's important is because that made her the first of William's children to be born after he had become King of England, and therefore she was born to the purple with royal blood.
It does also
And
seem like, for some reason, the dates of her birth and death and a couple other dates are a little unclear.
unknown. Yeah.
Yeah, but
She could have been born a little bit earlier, but because of some poetry written to her that talks about her royal purple blood, I like to think she was born after William was crowned. During that time
Mhm.
after, remember last episode when William came finally back to Normandy after being crowned and went on that tour with his kind of English people that he had forced to come over with him. I feel like it was during that time that she was conceived. But anyway, we're not sure.
I guess the cynical take would be that she was born before, but then after he took over, they kind of rewrote it so that she was born in the purple.
Rewriting history? Surely not.
Never, never.
She used the fact of her prestigious blood throughout her life to get what she needed. And interestingly, in charters and letters that she wrote years after her father died, she styled herself as I, Adela, Countess of Blois, and daughter of William, the glorious King of the English. So even though her brothers were King of England by that point, she was still talking about being the daughter of her father. So he still clearly
Hmm.
had a great reputation that she was using to her advantage.
I did read that. So I guess she was the fourth daughter, and she was born
Fourth or
in
fifth.
Normandy.
Yeah.
But it is believed that she was the uh, favorite sister of King Henry the First of England, and the two were probably the youngest of his children.
Yes. Yeah, because Henry was born in 1068, I believe, or early 1069. So there was only between 10 months and maybe a year and a half between them. And the other kids were all older. I mean, Robert, the eldest, was by that time probably in his early 20s or definitely a late teen. So there was kind of like the older kids who had been around when their dad was just Duke of Normandy. And then Adela and Henry, the only two born after, and also close in age. So I do feel like evidence shows that throughout their lives, they were close allies to one another. And Adela basically saved Normandy for Henry, in my opinion. So because of Adela, Henry was
Mm.
able to capture his their eldest brother, Robert, and become Duke of Normandy and reunite the Anglo-Norman Empire.
Right, because don't forget, in case for some reason you're jumping in right now, that at this moment, England not only covers basically modern day England, but it also has parts of northern France, like Normandy and I think Maine, um,
Back and
at the
forth
time.
on Maine.
But would you agree with the characterization of Adela that she was a high-spirited, educated woman with a knowledge of Latin and could read and write in several languages?
That is true. She had real Latin literacy, unlike her brothers. Her mom education was very important to her mother, Matilda. So all the girls were educated, but she was one of very few noble women that could both read and write in Latin, and very few of the men could do that unless they were members of the church. And because of that, well, after she's married, there's something called a translocation of Saint Helena's bones. Saint Helena, the mother of Constantine, the Roman emperor who basically be- caused Rome to become a Christian
Mhm.
empire. And Saint Helena was Adela's favorite saint. And so they were moving the bones of Saint Helena from one place to a second location in France. And the archbishop was there to do it, but then Adela was also on the stage with him, and she was the only non-church person on the stage, and her role was to read the Latin inscriptions that had been on the different relics and translate them for the crowd that had gathered. So she was kind of celebrated for her literacy.
Interesting,
She
and I
We
guess
have
she
actually letters, and well, we have a lot of charters that she signed, not as many as I would like, but we have some charters that she signed, and we have letters that Steve and her husband wrote to her. So it's fun to see the actual correspondence that she was able to do.
do we really know much about her childhood before she gets married?
No, we do believe that she spent some part of it with the nuns at the Abbey of St. Trinity in Cannes, where her sister had been put as a nun at an early age, and it's the same abbey where her mother is buried. And so we think that she got some of her education there. And while her mother is busy having to serve as regent for Normandy, while William is off in England, she didn't have a lot of time to also be taking care of her children. So I think that's why I do think
Uh-huh.
Adela did travel some to the different courts and was with her family at different points in time, but she also spent several years at the abbey. But otherwise, we don't really know. In my mind, she was a favorite of her father's,
Mhm.
but I have no evidence to back that up.
I mean, if I were her, I would rather stay in one place rather than William just constantly going back and forth everywhere, every couple months.
Right. Exactly.
So then do you
Um,
wanna just talk about who she marries then?
Sure. So, well, she did grow up in a family that, as we know, was as dysfunctional as it was successful. We talked a little bit about how her brothers were constantly fighting, both with among themselves for power over the other, and the eldest brother with their father. Um, so Adela grew up in a family that was both powerful and dysfunctional,
Mhm.
and um, very busy, traveling a lot.
Mhm.
And she knew that she could never be like her father or her brothers and be leading armies into battle to gain more land and more power. So she learned to be skilled at forming alliances. And I think that she watched her mom. And she also learned from her aunt Emma, the former Queen of England's um, chronicle that Emma had done, I think, and also other women. I think she learned from that how she had to rule in a different way.
Mm.
So yeah, around 1083, she was married to Count Stephen Henry, and she was only between 13 and 16 years old at the time, and he was about 20 years older. And she had several older unmarried sisters, Constance and Matilda, and possibly Agatha. So why
Mm.
was she married to Stephen Henry when she had older unmarried sisters available to marry? Because normally you would expect the older girls to be betrothed first. But Stephen specifically asked for Adela because of the fact that she had the royal blood that her sisters lacked.
Ah. And he's the
Um,
Count of Blois, right?
Blois
Mm,
and Chartres. So basically, the King of France really only was in charge of the area of Paris and the Ile-de-France, which is the area
mm,
just around Paris.
mhm.
And Stephen Henry, and I'm going to call his family the Thibotans, named after his father Thibaut. They
Thibaut.
controlled the county of Blois, which included Chartres and Blois, which was to the west of Paris. And they controlled the county of Champagne, which was to the east of Paris, where we get our champagne today, and
Mm,
then little bridges of land to the north and south of that that connected their counties. And Stephen Henry's father controlled the whole thing. But when his father died, Stephen, as the eldest, was given the Chartres and Blois, and his younger stepbrother was given the Champagne region. But Stephen was still ultimately the one in charge of everything, and his brother Hugo was the lesser count who lived in the Champagne region and kind of controlled that. But also, I was going to say that Stephen Henry was the legitimate heir to Maine through a complicated lineage through his mother. Really, his mother had been married to the Count of Maine. So when the Count of Maine died, it Stephen had the best claim to it. And as we've talked about before, the County of Maine was one that William the Conqueror and his son Robert and the Count of Anjou were constantly fighting over because it was a border county between Normandy and France and Anjou. So Stephen kind of gave up his claim to Maine in part of an exchange of getting Adela, because Adela, being
mm.
the daughter of William, raised this already powerful family's prestige even further. I mean, this county, even though today we don't really think of it as being very important, it was very powerful, one of the most powerful after Normandy at the time. And Stephen had as many castles as there were days in a year. So
From
he had
365?
a lot of castles.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I did see that were all the castles made out of stone? Because I saw that
No,
first they would make them out of, like, mud or dirt, and then they would do wood, and
it
then they would do
would.
stone, but
Yeah.
sometimes they were just wood and they'd stay as wood.
Yeah, I'm sure not all of them.
Yeah.
You were absolutely right about how they were built. They started out with wood, and I'm sure that they weren't all made into stone. And
Huh.
remember, at each of these castles, they need to have a Castilian person there managing that castle for them. And because France was so divided, I wish next time we'll have a map to show you the divisions at the time, but Anjou had the county of Anjou, and Stephen had the county of Blois, et cetera, et cetera. And so there were obviously all these borders, and all the castles, clearly focused on the important areas and the border areas. And so the Castilians that were on the border areas could kind of play both sides, right? And decide who they were
Mm,
going to be most loyal to, depending on who was giving them the most advantage at the time. So there was
interesting.
a lot of that kind of political balancing work that they had to constantly be doing. So, when Adela first married Stephen, I don't think she was given very much power because she was like maybe 16 at the oldest. And her father in law, very powerful father in law, was still alive. And Stephen was the junior count. And I think in my mind, she was super frustrated by that because what she's supposed to do, she's supposed to get pregnant and have an heir. That's her only job. And she wanted power and she wanted something to do rather than just have sex to give birth to an heir.
Right.
But she was frustrated as long as her father-in-law was alive. But as soon as he died and Stephen became the count in his own right, then he lifted Adela up to be basically co-count with him. And
Yes.
almost all of his charters and his rulings, he had Adela by his side, and she was signing on just after him. So I think in my mind, she asked for it, and either he recognized that having her there gave him this prestige because of her family's power, and she really wanted it and fought for it.
Apparently,
and he trusted her.
they might have had 11 children, some just maybe as low as 7, but some of the big ones, were William of Sully, Theobald the Fourth of Champagne and Blois, Stephen, the future king of England, spoilers, Henry, Bishop of Winchester, Agnes, and Eleanor. Does that sound
Yeah,
right?
I well, the only daughter we know for sure that were their was their child was Matilda, also called Lucia. Um, and then Agnes may have been her child or may have been a stepdaughter, an illegitimate child of Stephen Henry's before he married Adela, because obviously being 20 years older than her, he may have had illegitimate children spread around. So yeah, we don't know for sure, but she definitely had 5 sons. William, the oldest, um, then Theo. Oh no, I'm sorry. Then Odo, who died. He seemed to have maybe been born with a disability or possibly gotten sick as a child, but he was always known for having an illness or some issue that he ended up dying as a young boy. Then Theo, then Stephen, and then when Stephen Henry comes back from the Crusade, which we'll talk about in a minute, they conceived the youngest child, Henry, who became Bishop of Winchester and basically a kingmaker in England in his later life. So he was among the wealthiest bishops and most powerful churchmen of the time. So
Cool.
she did have quite a few children, mostly
And
sons.
legacy.
Yep.
Well, speaking of legacy, do you wanna do a little, break right now and go talk about William for a second?
Sure.
So last week, if you listened, we already broke it up into 2 parts, but there were still a couple quick things I wanted to talk about her father, William the Conqueror, and also we wanna do more segments in general, maybe, like, at the halfway point, we'll sort of have a little break, but since this is already a special episode, as you can see by my lack of chainmail,
Right.
I did that in honor of Adela. I'm going hair free. Um, but for this segment, let's just reflect on some things I didn't say about William. So, one thing I thought was interesting was that he didn't really attempt to kind of integrate his separate domains into one unified realm with one set of laws. He basically kept them as 2 separate realms that he ruled both of, but they weren't one thing. And like there is some seal that we still have some that we can look at today that mention his role as king and role as duke as a separate thing. And so basically, when he was in England, he wasn't really under the control of the French king. Like his French lands kind of were, but his English lands had no connection. Um, and some things that were different in England, they had
Well, I'll
writ.
just interrupt for a second, and
Yeah.
that created an awkward issue because he was supposed to give homage to the French king for Normandy, which may or may not have involved kissing the king's feet or,
Mhm.
some sort of humility to show that you agree you're underneath him. And
Right.
as King of England, who was at least as powerful as the King of France, William had zero intention of humiliating himself in front of the French king to do that, so that was a big issue they had to work on.
Yeah, and if you're wondering why is there even a French king right now when it seems like he doesn't really have any actual power over the rest of them, it seems to me like it's just sort of because there was Charlemagne a couple, 100 years before, then it's his ancestors. It basically is just a legacy of Charlemagne. They still have some, you know, cachet, but at this point, the French kings are not that powerful at the moment.
I feel like that it was kind of a situation where you had all these powerful people ruling their own lands, and they decided kind of amongst themselves they needed to have one that was designated as almost like chair of the board or something, you
Mm,
know?
mm-mm,
And so it kinda and then Hugh Capet got put into that position, and he started the Capetian line of kings,
mm,
and he gradually worked on making it more like a traditional kingship, but it had started as kind of like, okay, for an organizational thing, let's just kind of nominally have someone
mhm.
that's called something, for
Somewhat in
for
charge.
administrative purposes.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And apparently the English government at this moment was more complex than the Norman system. It was divided up into shires or counties, and then those were divided into hundreds, which we've talked about before, but France didn't really have a system like that of these like tiny little counties. And every shire was administered by a royal official called a sheriff. The Normans kind of had an equivalent called a viscount. The sheriff, not only did he do like justice, like you would think of as a sheriff, but he also was basically a tax collector. And I had mentioned how William moved around a lot, but just to get more specific about it, he apparently crossed between the continent and England at least 19 times between 1067 and his death. And it basically, this, to sum it up, is that most of his time was in England between Hastings and 1072, and then after that, he was mainly in Normandy. And he continued the collection of Danegeld, which is basically worked as a land tax, which is interesting because we know how it started, where it was connected with the Vikings taking over, Eastern England and paying them off and everything. But um, essentially, at this point, doing that meant it was the only universal tax collected in Western Europe during this period, was only happening in England. So that gave them a big advantage to be able to fund more
Hmm.
things. And again, we're going to see England a lot of times acts as basically a bank for other
Yep.
other countries, essentially. So yeah, and one last thing about that was that apparently the English coins had higher silver content, higher artistic standards, were reminted every 3 years, whereas Norman coins had lower silver. They weren't really reminted; they were lower quality. And in England, you could only accept English tender, but on the continent, you could take other coins. You could take English coins, and there's no attempt to integrate those two monetary systems. They were kept separate. And he also, just last thing about William, is he had a lot of land, not only because as King Edward's heir, he had all the former royal lands, but also because he defeated Harold and his family, he got all of his land. So he was the largest secular landowner in England by a wide margin. All right. Now back to his daughter, Adela. Do you want to talk about her
Well,
regency during the First Crusade, or is that
yeah,
jumping too
yeah, I
far?
do. But first, I'll just note that, the county of Blois issued its own coinage. The county of Anjou issued its own coinage. So, whereas England had a countrywide
Hmm.
coinage, in
It-
France, they had individual.
that makes
Yeah.
sense.
So the Pope called for this crusade, which we won't have time to go into, in 1095. And Stephen wanted to join up, or maybe Adela wanted him to join up, unclear. Um, and many people did. No one from not no leading people. The King of England did not come. It was
Hmm.
mostly people on the continent, and it was
It was
quite
pretty
expensive.
dangerous. Pretty
It
dangerous.
was dangerous, and it was quite expensive to go on crusade because you have to pay for the men that you need, the horses that you need, and the food that you need for that long journey all the way to Jerusalem. And in
Mhm.
fact, it was so expensive, Robert, Duke of Normandy, her oldest brother, wanted to go on the crusade, but he couldn't afford it, even though he was Duke of Normandy. So he mortgaged Normandy to his brother William Rufus, the King of England, which was awesome for William because he had been trying to get Normandy. So he was supposed to have to give it back when Robert returned. We'll see how that
Mhm.
goes. But anyway, so
Right, right.
Robert had to, mortgage his whole company. And Stephen's crusade was paid for by Adela.
Oh.
So I'm not sure how she got all that money, but she was a wise manager of her lands for sure. And I don't know that she
Mhm.
paid 100% of it, but she is known for funding his portion of the crusade. So Robert of Normandy and Stephen Henry and also Robert, Count of Flanders, all went together in this northern France contingent on the crusade, and Stephen left his wife Adela in charge as his regent. And she was, doing everything, making the rules, issuing the charters, running everything in his absence. And he was gone for quite a long time. And she did a great job. Meanwhile, Stephen Henry, they did well at first. They won in Nicaea, and he wrote to
Mhm.
her. We have his letters surviving, and he's like, "Yeah, I think I'll be home in a month. All is going great."
Classic.
But it didn't happen that way that he had envisioned, and they were stuck in Antioch for, like, I think a year. And meanwhile, people were starving and, things were going really badly and it looked like they were certain to lose. So Stephen's like, out of here. And he leaves. And literally the day after he leaves, the Crusaders conquer Antioch. And ultimately, they go on to Jerusalem shortly thereafter. But Stephen Henry, on his way out the door, goes, seeks out the Constantine emperor. He was on his way to try to help the Crusaders and is like, hey, bro, it's
Mhm.
lost. You're just wasting your resources. You should just head back home. And because Stephen did that and the emperor didn't come to help them as he had promised, then when the Crusaders did actually capture Jerusalem, they didn't give the land to Constantinople as they had promised. They're like, oh, you broke the promise when you didn't come help us. So we are going to take over. We Normans and French are going to take over and rule these countries. So Stephen had an integral role to play in that. Anyway, he heads home.
Okay.
And at first, when he gets home, everyone's super happy, like he made it home because, news hadn't traveled back that Jerusalem had ultimately been captured. But when word got back that the Crusaders had actually captured Antioch and captured Jerusalem, then those like Stephen who had left early and had not fulfilled the vow that they took when they undertook the crusade were deemed cowards and threatened with excommunication. And actually, this is why I decided 10 years ago to write a book about Adela, because every
Oh,
book that you read about her family mentions this crucial thing about Adela. And Odoric Vitalis wrote about it. And it was that he says that she berated her husband relentlessly for breaking his crusading vow. And even in the bedroom and even during intimacy, she was harping on him that he had to go back. It's a
wow.
wildly vivid and specific detail for a medieval chronicle to include about a noblewoman. Um, and Odoric wasn't there, obviously, but this is the story that gets told. And this is the most famous thing about Adela is that she nagged her husband and forced him to go back on crusade, on the Cowards Crusade, it was called, which was a minor
Wow.
crusade that was undertaken by the cowards who had left early. They had to go back to fulfill their oath. And so that was like a year after he had gotten back to France. So during that year, she did conceive Henry, ultimate Bishop of Winchester. Henry goes back, Stephen Henry goes back, and Adela's again ruling. And Stephen actually did a good job when he went back. He helped King Baldwin of Jerusalem was in this fight and had Stephen was fighting beside him and they had won that battle. But then Baldwin was like, now I'm going to go fight over here in Ramallah. And Stephen's like, that's stupid. We're way outnumbered. Don't do that. But he's like, no, I'm going to do it anyway. And so they lost and Stephen was killed along with many other people in that battle. But he died heroically fighting. So he did regain his reputation. He was not excommunicated and he died a hero, but he did die, leaving Adela around her mid 30s as a widow. And being a widow was the most powerful position you could have as a woman because now you weren't really underneath the thumb of either a husband or a father.
This almost
And
seems like she had ulterior motives for sending him
no,
back. It's like, "Oh,
I don't think
yeah,
she
you're
wanted him
still
to die.
alive? Actually, you should go back.
That's
Go
not true.
really deep in this time and fight really hard."
No. But what is interesting is that her eldest son, William, was, I don't know, like 14 at the time. So she was ruling as regent, and he had already been named as the heir. So she was ruling as regent for her son. And that lasted about a year. William was a little bit hot-headed, much like William Rufus, and also maybe even his grandfather, William the Conqueror.
Before you jump into that, though, before you move past it, like, do you feel like Adela moved past it that quickly? Like, do you feel like it's like, "Oh, my husband died," or not only was she sad that he died, but do you think she felt any sort of guilt about, "Oh, wow, I really pressured him to go back and then he died," or is it like, "Ah, that's how all great men should go, is die in a holy war"?
I have mixed feelings, and I think she had mixed feelings about it because, on one hand, I don't think Stephen Henry was a great warrior. I don't think he cared about battles. So unlike all of her family, right? So I
Mhm.
feel like she always thought it was a little odd that he would rather be diplomatic and enjoy life. So even though he was one of the leaders of the crusade, his leadership was not so much in battle, but as the administrative mediator between all the high ranking nobles that were there, who all maybe had different things they wanted to do and were fighting for their own power. And Stephen was elected head of the council because he could mediate with them. So all of that was so unlike what she viewed as a man showing his power. And so on one hand, I think she probably was that if he was going to die, that he died fighting and as a hero, because
Mhm.
that was more in keeping with her view of how men should act.
Mhm.
Um, on the other hand, and I don't know that she ever truly loved him. He was much older than her, but he did do what she asked. You know, he did give her co-ruling power. He did give her many children. So in my story, she develops an appreciation for him over the years. And some of that doesn't come until after his death.
Interesting. Yeah, I saw that she's called the heroine of the First Crusade. She became a generous patron of poets and writers, invited them to her court, rewarding them for their work. Does that seem right?
I think it's important to remember that if Stephen had been excommunicated, that was a huge weakness for their family at that time. You no longer had the power of the church behind you, and Adela relied on the power and relationships with the church, especially as a woman. She needed to have that church authority on her side to convince these Castilians who could change side that even though she couldn't armor up for battle, she could bring the power of the church with her. And that's why they should stay by her side. And if
Mhm.
he had been excommunicated, it would have caused a lot of vulnerability in their lands. And the Count of Anjou could have come in and grabbed some. The Castilians could have switched loyalties, and it would have been chaos for both Adela and their children that needed to inherit something. So
Yeah.
I think we're living in such a different world now that we don't
Yeah.
appreciate how dramatic it was to be excommunicated at that time.
And the last thing I was gonna say is I don't think she was too rare with how she felt, and I'm not an expert on this, but I do know in a lot of more like the classical Greece era and all that kind of time period, like Sparta, if you were a warrior, which is like most men, or if you're in a war and you are retreating or you are whatever, you're coming back home early, like, it's not like I think some nowadays we sort of think of maybe women just back home, like, crying and just being like, "Oh, I want my husband to come home from this war," but I feel like back then, if they felt like it was a good war, like, we need to take over this land or whatever it was, the women were on board, they were, like, helping out the war effort, and they would kinda shame their husbands into
Yeah,
fighting.
I remember in ancient times, I can't remember, it was someone that was fighting the Romans, and I guess the Visigoths or somebody, and the women had the reputation of sending their husband off to fight and basically saying, I can't remember the exact wording, but you either come home as the victor or dead on a shield. I don't want you like running from the battle and coming back
Mhm.
alive and having lost. No, you either die or you win.
Mhm.
So,
Something women upholding the patriarchy, but, we don't have time for that.
no, we don't have
So
time for that. In a lot of stories, the son would have come of age and taken over after a few years, right? So we do hear of powerful women having this regency and having this power for a few years for their son. But within a number of years, when the son reaches his age of majority, whether that's 16 or 18, then the mother goes away, and now it's all the son.
mhm,
But Adela, whether justifiably or not, and her eldest son William does definitely have a reputation for having a hot temper. She replaced William after a year as heir, basically kicked him out of the took the heirship away from him, which her father, remember, never did for Robert, even though he was tempted to. She
Right.
instead said, nope, you're going to go off and you can you can marry this woman who inherited a smaller county in northern France, and you can rule that area, but you're no longer going to be involved in the workings of Chartres. And I think that was the right thing to do because of his temperament, but
Hmm.
also conveniently, it meant that now it was pushed down to Theo. And remember, there was another son, Odo, between William and Theo. So Theo
Hmm.
had to be at least like 2.5 years younger than William. So that's
Hmm.
giving her at least 2.5 more years to
Oh,
rule before
wow.
Theo's going to come to his majority.
She's power hungry.
Well, I mean, I'm just saying, maybe it was the thing to do just because of his temperament, but it had a nice side benefit of it gives her more time in undisputed power. But
Right.
she and Theo either got along so well or she was persuasive enough that even after he achieved majority, they continued to rule together for many, many years, and they would sign charters. Mother and son speak jointly. I, Adela, Countess of Blois, and Thibaut, my son. So it wasn't like I on behalf of my son or Thibaut
Mhm.
being the lead. So she was still the lead for many years, like I think 20 some odd years.
So wait, you pronounce Theobald? It's not Theobald, it's Thibaut?
It's spelled different ways. I think the French spelling is Thibaut,
Oh.
Thibaut, and the English is more Theobald. But that's why I
Interesting.
sometimes call him Theo, like he's a good friend of mine,
Mm.
because I'm not really sure how to pronounce it.
I like being very familiar with these
Yeah,
figures.
right.
Okay.
So she and Theo rule really well with they build a strong relationship with Bishop Ivo of Chartres and many other people. So, kind of hurrying along in the story, excuse me. Meanwhile, her brothers are constantly fighting over Normandy, right? Because first William Rufus and then Henry are trying to acquire Normandy because it was a problem. The Norman nobility who had fought with William the Conqueror and now owned land in England and still had their land in Normandy were feeling like it was one thing when they were all one empire, but when they were separated, then they kind of had to choose
Right.
um, which land are they going to take? And they didn't like that, so everyone was trying to get it back reunited. And Robert tried to reunite it himself, but we'll go into these
Right.
battles when we're talking about those kings. But so fast forward to when Henry is king of England, and he's trying to fight and doing pretty well in fighting his brother Robert for Normandy with the church behind him. He's flying the banner of the Pope and everything's going fine because, people had sworn their fealty to Robert as heir of Normandy. So they had to have some reason to switch to Henry. But if the church is behind Henry, okay. But then, because of this investiture crisis, which could have his own separate episode, which was basically the church wanted to say who got to be archbishop and bishop, and Henry wanted the king still to be able to have that power and refused to give
Hmm.
it to the church. So
Hmm.
the Pope said, "Oh, I'm just going to excommunicate you." And as we just said, excommunication takes away a lot of your power. And Henry was afraid he couldn't conquer Normandy without the backing of the church. So Adela, either sick or pretending to be sick, sends a message to Anselm, who was on his way. He was the messenger from the Pope who was on his way to go tell Henry, "You're excommunicated." And Adela says, "Oh, please come and see me. I might be on my deathbed. I really need to see you." So he diverts from meeting Henry in Normandy and comes to see Adela. And she convinces him that she should go with him and they can negotiate with Henry a compromise. So she and Anselm then go together with Henry and they do negotiate a compromise, the details of which escape me at the moment. But
Right.
suffice to say that Henry avoids being excommunicated and therefore maintains the ability to fight Robert with the church's backing and ultimately prevails. So I say Adela should be credited with why Henry was able to reunite Normandy and England.
Cool.
And
You
that's
know who
just
she
one
kinda
of.
reminds me of, like, in her later years? I just had
Mhm.
this flash, is if you've seen Game of Thrones, sort of this woman, Alanna Tyrell, but she's just sort of very nice, kind of kindly older woman, but very smart and kind of scheming in the background.
So I'll move on then to what happens with her children. Her daughter, unfortunately, dies in the White Ship episode, which we will be featuring 2 episodes from now. Her eldest son, William, as we said, was sent off to be count of a minor little area in northern France, and we don't really hear from him again. Um, Odo had died as like a teenager. So then we've got Theo, and he was given he was going to inherit Blois, but also he's looking over at his uncle Hugo, who was Count of Champagne. Remember, underneath the Della was the Count of Champagne, which was becoming a more and more powerful county because its location was such that trade would come through it between Asia and Italy on its way to England and vice versa. So
Right.
Adela really kind of established this idea in my mind. I don't have absolute proof of this, but I think she saw the benefits of having important fairs in Champagne, which they called the occasions when the merchants would come on these special fairs and do trading of their goods. And then of course the count of that area received a portion of all the trade.
That seems
So
like that's also one of my, I feel like, most romantic visions of, like, medieval Europe is those type of fairs where all the carts are gathered around and there's, like, a little circus going on. I love that,
exactly. And
anyway.
Champagne was better located for that than Chartres and Blois. So basically, long story short is Hugh didn't have any children for quite a long time. So Theo kind of trained with Hugh, and the idea was he would take over if Hugo didn't have any children. Hugo then marries French King Philip's daughter. I think her name was Constance, and they do have a child. But for some reason, I think with Adela and Theo's impact maneuverings,
Yeah.
Hugo decided, I don't trust that that's my legitimate child. So he's basically accusing the French princess of adultery. So he disinherits who may or may not have been his biological child, but I think was his biological child, and instead leaves Champagne to Theo. So Theo ends up being the count of both Chartres, Blois, and the Champagne region. And over time, I think largely because of the wealth that was generated by these fairs in the Champagne region, he it, Champagne became the center of the family's rule, and they kind
Mm,
of forgot about Blois and Chartres.
okay.
And Theo eventually became known as Theo the Great as
Oh.
Count of Champagne. So he was super powerful in France during his later years.
Hmm.
And his daughter, Adela, named after the mom, ends up
Oh,
marrying the King of France.
do you
I
know
think
what
it's Louis
Adela
this.
means? It
No,
means
I
no,
know that Adela's grandmother, who was a princess of France, was named Adela.
it
And
means
then,
basically noble.
oh, okay,
So,
perfect.
yeah.
So yeah, so her granddaughter Adela, Theo's daughter, marries the King of France, and Adela gives birth to King Philip Auguste, who we'll hear a lot about when we're talking about English kings, Richard the Lionheart and John. And Philip Auguste built a wall around Paris that we can still see remnants of today. So he was a very powerful king, and that was her great grandson. So that's
Cool.
Theo. Now, as we'll discuss in the next episode about Henry Rufus dies, and when that happens, the English throne is temporarily open. No, I'm sorry. I was confusing. Henry, Adela's brother Henry takes over then. But then when Henry dies, now we're going to have another debate about who should be holding the throne of England because of this white ship episode.
which we
And
won't say yet.
a
Yeah.
lot of the Norman nobility felt Theo should be king.
Oh.
But Stephen, her next son, who's Stephen, named after his father, Stephen Henry, had been with Henry, had been kind of been raised in his uncle Henry's court. And Henry ends up obtaining the throne of England. So he will be a king of England that we'll be discussing in a future episode as well. But it's interesting to note that some people thought it should be Theo because Theo's older than Stephen. But Theo is just like, fine, you take it, Stephen. I'll
I'm
just keep
busy drinking
champagne.
champagne. I'm good.
Exactly, exactly. And then the youngest son, Henry of Blois, was basically raised in the church because I think Adela felt she had her hands full when she learned that her husband had been killed and she was now going to be ruling alone. And this boy, Henry, was only maybe 2 years old. And it was somewhat common, although this is towards the end of the time period that this happened, that you would basically drop off your child at age 2 or 3 with the monastery as an oblate. So they had no choice in
Hmm.
the matter. It's not like they chose to be in the church. They were
Right.
basically given to the church. The church
Like the
ultimately got rid of
orphanage.
that. But
Yeah.
so Henry was raised in the church, but that didn't mean he left out on the power because as Bishop of Winchester, and he was also abbot of Glastonbury and a papal legate, and he had and at the time, remember, Winchester was where the treasury in England was, and it was a very wealthy thing to be bishop of, and he was politically formidable and important in the reign of his brother, King Stephen. In
That's
1120,
yeah.
Adela
But
retired.
yeah, before you get into retirement, I've just while you've been talking, I've just been thinking about just it's kind of crazy how big of an impact Christianity has on all of this. Like just even the concept that I'm the king, but actually the Pope is sort of above me, but I don't really like that necessarily. And just how that's always been such a big conflict, even from the beginning of who's really in charge. And all these bishops are powerful, even though I'm not really, they're not my guys. They're from, the church and just how I think it's hard to overemphasize how important the church is.
It is. And, like when Constantine established Christianity as the official religion of Rome, he had much more power than the Pope. And basically, he would call these
Right.
councils of Nicaea or whatever. But then if he got frustrated with they couldn't decide or whatever, Constantine would just be like, nope, this is what the rule is. So
Yeah. Right.
you've got this warrior emperor guy deciding, okay, it's going to be the Holy Trinity and this is how it's going to work. And
Hmm.
then around this time, before this, it had always been the case, or mostly been the case, that the king, as we said, chose the archbishop, chose the bishop. So they knew that their guy was in and they could kind of control him. And it was Pope Gregory that was like, I don't think that sounds right. Let's come up with all
Hmm.
these reforms. So Adela actually supported the reforms because, again, as a woman who couldn't go into battle herself or didn't feel capable of didn't choose to go into battle, she really needed the support of the church. And by supporting church reform, that gave her an elevated position that caused the church to want to be supportive of her more. So even though it was kind of counterintuitive, because it was kind of counter to what her brothers were fighting for, which was to maintain the king's power, she was kind of supporting the reforms, but carefully. Like
Hmm.
she also got into fights with the church. And she was sometimes at cross purposes, and Bishop Evo would write her and be like, Adela, like, are you sure you want to do this? Because I don't think that was really the right thing to do. And he would take her to task, and she could be really harsh. And then there's some people that say she was a very harsh ruler, but of course she was, as we talked about before, to be an effective ruler at the time, you needed to be aggressive and ruthless in certain circumstances. So,
Yeah, I don't think there's many rulers at this point that were all peace and love in every regard. So
no.
yeah, you want to talk about her retirement? She retires in Marsigny, the Priory of
Marcinet,
Marcinec?
Yeah, which I've never, doesn't sound like a very powerful place, but I think she realized that she had to step down because at some point Theo needs to get married and start having babies himself and needs to finally take over. So she in 1120 gave up her title and entered this monastery where she may or may not, I think it's called a priory. I don't know
Mhm.
the difference, but she may or may not have ultimately become abbess there, but she certainly still stayed involved in politics, and powerful people, when they were coming from Rome or for Jerusalem, they would often pass through this area and she would meet with them and she would write if she would pay attention to what was going on with Theo's rule and with the Chartres church, etc. And if anyone was doing something she didn't agree with, she would write to them and remind them that, remember, I made this ruling in this charter at this day, and this is what it's supposed to be, so she didn't just
Wow.
let it go.
Right. She
Um,
knew what she was signing. She wasn't just putting her name down.
exactly. So she still kept power. She wasn't just like in a nun praying all the time. And she died in Marseille in 1137 after her son had become king of England. So she got to see her son Theo become the great count and her son Stephen become king and her son Henry become Bishop of Winchester. So she knew that she
Not too
had done what
shabby.
she had set out to do.
Yeah, that's a good lineage you got going.
And she's venerated by the Catholic Church, and she even was made a saint. Well, I don't know. Okay, a Catholic could call me on this because there is a saint's day for Adela, February 24th, which is my father's birthday, by the way. But
Hmm.
does that mean she was officially made as a saint? I think so, because to
I
have a
believe she is a
saint's
saint.
day,
Yeah, I think she is.
um, on the strength of her religious patronage and her retirement into monastic life, they made her a saint.
And
So even
probably
though
related with the Crusade situation.
yeah, that could be too. Like you said, she was called what? The Queen of the Crusades or something?
Yeah, something like that.
So even though she was not officially a queen, for about 40 years in an important corner of France, she was a very important ruler and she was integral into the running of England as well during this time because of her relationship with her brother Henry. And so again, as I said, her granddaughter was Queen of France, and her great grandson was an important King of France. So comparing her to her brother Robert Curthose ended up being imprisoned for almost 3 decades. Her brother William Rufus became a king but died childless fairly young. Her brother Henry was a successful king, but his plans for his succession with his own son collapsed for reasons will to be discussed later. So even though Adela never inherited a kingdom or commanded an army or wore a crown, she did create a dynasty that penetrated both English and French royal politics and
Mhm.
arguably was the best of William the Conqueror's children at building a dynasty.
And apparently, in 1966, there was a BBC televised play called Conquest, where she was played by actress Nike Arigi. So maybe you guys can
Oh, I'll have
check
to go
that
watch
out.
it. I didn't even know that existed.
Yeah, I'll send you a link.
So I
I
really love Adela, and I feel like this didn't really come out in the story, but I feel like ever since she saw the Bayeux Tapestry and realized that in this huge tapestry, there were only 3 women, she realized that women were left out and excluded in the history, and she fought to be included and to make her story known. And interestingly, there's a poem that was written about her, and the poem describes her bedroom and it describes her as having a more luxurious version of the Bayeux Tapestry in her bedroom along the walls with the star system on her ceiling and
Ooh,
map of the world on the floor. So it sounds like a very ornate
that
room that
sounds
she was in.
awesome. I would love that.
Yeah.
I would have that room. Well, I have a tough question for you. It's
Oh
similar
dear.
to one I asked you last week, but I think even harder.
Mm.
So I do feel that, well, so I don't know if I think we said this, but important to note that you are in the midst of writing a book about Adela coming to
Historic
all
fiction.
bookstores soon.
So I hope.
Um, but I asked you last week your if you had to say your least favorite thing about William. What is your least favorite thing about Adela? Her biggest flaw, her biggest mistake, something you feel
Well,
like,
I think so this brings up something that I forgot to mention earlier. I think that her biggest flaw was that she never did, have a chronicler write her story. So the only part that got sent through history was this nagging of her husband, and we didn't hear all the great things she had done. And she knew from her Aunt Emma that had written the chronicle that she could do it, but she didn't do it. So I think that was her biggest mistake. I think also um, she she grew up in this, like we said, this oh, anyway, why I wanna mention that is because a few years ago, I went to Blois, to the castle at Blois, where Adela had lived and ruled so powerfully for those 20 plus years, and I asked the historian, the local historian at the castle, "What can you tell me about what's here from the 11th, 12th centuries? Can you
hmm
tell me about Adela that I may not know?" And the woman says, "Who's Adela?" And I'm like, "Who's Adela? She was the Countess of Blois who lived in this castle. What are you talking about?" And they're like, "Oh, never heard of her."
that's and then I remember you
Be-
were like, she's like, what year or what
yeah,
century? And you were like
I said the
12
11th century. He's like,
or
oh,
11.
too long ago. So I go on this tour nonetheless since I'm there, and it's all about King Francois the First and the Renaissance and all the stuff that was done during the Renaissance. And so I'm about halfway through the tour, and the historian comes running after me, and she's all excited because she had, I guess, gotten interested enough in figuring out who this Adela person was that she had Googled her on Wikipedia, and she then was telling me all about what she could find on
Hmm,
Wikipedia. So yeah, so
that's awesome.
because Adela didn't commission a story to be written about herself, then she was forgotten even at the castle where she ruled.
Well, I hope this podcast and your book also do that same thing and make people excited to learn more about her. I'm not even going to hold your feet to the fire because that was the most political answer I've ever heard. Very level headed. What's the worst thing about her? She didn't have a book written about her because she's so perfect. She literally, that's, we just don't know enough about her. That's her only flaw. If only we knew more.
Exactly.
So very unbiased point of view over here at Rain Check.
Well, now
I
that
didn't
you've
even.
learned a little bit about Adela after having heard me talk about it for so long,
Oh,
what
I
is your
learned
thought
quite
about
a
her?
bit. That's a good question. Turning it back around on me. I
Not
mean,
necessarily the
honestly, I
worst thing, but just in general.
just in general, yeah. I mean, this probably isn't it, but the first thing that comes to mind is I think that it'd be interesting. You could almost write two separate books. You could write one book where she's this like saintly, angelic woman, um, like you kind of want to. Oh, and then you could write like another book that's almost like she is this almost like conniving, like not quite, I'm not saying she's evil or anything, but it's like, oh, like go back to the Crusades. I want to be in charge. And I want my younger son to be in charge. So I have 2 more years of reign. And, she's just as power hungry as her dad. And honestly, I think that's kind of a more feminist view of just sort of
No,
like, she
no,
can
I
do it
agree.
too.
I think she was complicated and she had it all. She had a lot of ambition. She was frustrated at the fact that it's hard for women to be ambitious, and she was
Mm-hmm.
determined to show people that she was just as fucking good as her brothers were, you
Mm-hmm.
know? And in fact, she was a better ruler than any of her brothers, with the possible exception of Henry. So,
It does seem like, yeah, whenever you can get a female ruler, typically you don't really have the issues of, and then she got into a big brawl with her cousin and they killed each other, or, I mean,
mm,
I guess at the time it wasn't seen as like polite or it wasn't allowed for women to really fight at all. But yeah, it does seem like if you can get a good woman in there, she's really gonna be a strong leader as long as people will like follow her and everything.
there is a little exception during this period. There was a woman, I think her name was Isabel. There's also a woman in Italy that did suit up and go off to battle, and then there's this really horrible woman named Mabel,
Hmm.
whose son is also featured in Adela's book as an enemy. His name was Robert as well. Anyway, Mabel would like famous for poisoning people. So, I
Oh.
mean, I just want to clarify that it unusual, very unusual, but occasionally a woman would go off, maybe more as a figurehead than an actual. I don't think that the women really had the training to be able and the strength to be able to hold, the lance and
Well,
all
you
that
know,
stuff and
Joan of
actually
Arc.
engage. But
Don't forget about Joan of
that's
Arc.
true. Joan was great. Yeah. So there were some women that fought in battle, but it was highly unusual, and Adela chose not to do that.
Yeah, the last thing actually that reminded me, someone was talking about Bloody Mary, who will be much later, but they sort of, we call her Bloody Mary, and we don't view her very kindly, but there are a ton of other English kings who kill a lot more people than she did. But it's when a woman does it,
Yeah.
maybe it's more shocking, so it just
Yeah.
seems worse or something. But it's interesting, yeah. All right, well, we're just exactly at an hour and about 1 minute. So thank you for joining us. Check out the book. We'll post when it comes out, and next week we'll be back for our regular scheduled program, episode 22 about Henry Rufus. Is that right?
William
William
Rufus.
Rufus, pardon me. And yeah, occasionally we'll do stuff like this when we are excited about someone, but typically we will just be talking about the official kings and queens of England. We'll leave a comment if there is someone else you want us to talk about in the future. Follow us on Instagram at RainCheckPod. If you don't know, we're on YouTube. You can watch a video of this where we share images related to what we're talking about. All
I
right.
did ask an art historian just really quickly. I'm super
Yeah.
frustrated about this time period and why the faces are so poorly portrayed. I want to have a realistic picture
Hmm.
of these people.
Hmm.
And she told me that it's not necessarily the lack of talent as much as that was just kind of the style.
That
So
was the art style. I have
yeah,
heard that. I want to read more about that because I'm like, well, why are you choosing this weird art
yeah,
style?
I know. All
Yeah.
right.
All right.
Au
Well,
revoir.
au revoir. Bonsoir. And what's another French thing we can say? How do you say
Mm,
goodbye in French besides au
Au
revoir?
revoir. Salut.
Salut. Okay.
Bonsoir. Bonne
Ciao.
nuit.